I want to talk a little bit about the social legacy for women, and that's the idea for women, and what women should and shouldn't do, not necessarily what women were actually doing, although I like to talk a little bit about that too. So here's some guiding questions for this, about how, I want you to think a little bit about how women, do you think women reacted to the American Revolution, and did the revolution change their roles and responsibility, and what legacy did the American Revolution have for them, if any? I want to start talking about separate spheres. Now, the separate spheres is the ideology that men and women have completely different roles and responsibilities that don't overlap. That is, that there's a place for women to live and a place for men to live. So women in these situations would have certain types of work that they would do, and men would do separate works. And the image on the right is called Keep Within the Compass. And you can see that just above the top of the compass. And inside that compass is a woman who is clearly on a very wealthy estate, and she is clearly taking care of her garden, and behaving as sort of a proper lady should. And outside of that, on the outside, outside of the circle, it says, "Keep within compass, and you should be sure to avoid many troubles which others endure." You see some of the troubles that others endure, and it's a little bit hard to see, but there's a woman who's drunk, there's a woman who's in prison, there's a woman who's soliciting men, and there's a woman who's writing. So these are things that a proper woman would not do. Now, women in the 18th and 19th century also had a legal term that supported this separate spheres, and that was femme covert. And this is a legal term meaning that women were legally covered by their husbands and fathers. So any debt that a woman incurred or any crime she committed, it was the responsibility of her father or husband to pay the debt or to take care of the crime. The idea was occasionally, a husband or father would say, "Oh, you go ahead and punish her. I don't want to go ahead and punish her." But if a woman committed a crime, it was the husband who's responsible for making sure that his wife is in line, and then the government would then punish him for not keeping his wife in line. And this encouraged a relatively, uneven balance between men and women, where men were definitely in charge of women. And women's work, in many ways, was harder work. It had fewer advantages. It was often in the home. The idea is that women would have lots of children. We're looking at 10 to 12 children at this time period, of which 7 to 10 would survive, and they'd be working inside the home, helping raising them, and gardening, and making soap, making clothes, cooking, gardening. And men would work on farms with hand tools, right? So that's a long, hard day, but men's work was from maybe sun to sun, sun rising to sunset. But women's work was never done, right? It starts before the man wakes up, setting up the fire, getting stuff ready, and it ends after men's work is done. Now, almost everybody was married, right? Single people were very odd at this time. Over 90% of people got married. It's something like 80% today. I should say that femme covert meant that women couldn't vote, they couldn't serve on jury, they lost their name, right? You lost the right to be called by your first name. No one would ever call a woman by her first name. She would become Mrs., and then her husband's first name and last name. She owned nothing. She couldn't own any property, and divorce is almost impossible. A woman would have to petition the state legislature for a divorce, and it was only in case of abandonment or incontinence. The war actually did change a lot of things for women. There are a couple things that were really useful. One is all of the non-importation, the economic boycotts and the non-importation. One is because most women were the shoppers for the family. Men had to appeal to women not to buy British goods. And so all of a sudden women had a political voice, right, to buy or not to buy, right? Do you support the Patriots? Do you support the Loyalists? On top of that, if you don't buy British goods, you have to have American goods. And so if you don't buy British cloth, you have to have American cloth. Well, who makes the American cloth? Women, right? So you have to both encourage women not to buy British cloth, but also encourage women to spin cloth, to make homespun cloth. So this was a lot of work for women, and it gave women, for possibly the first time, a real political voice. So they become very politicized, and they want to get involved. And beforehand, that wasn't really possible. So again, we saw the image on the left of the Eddington ladies being made fun of by the British. And on the right, we have a woodcut of a woman participating, right? She has a musket in her hand. She has a tricorn hat. And this is this is actually a British representation of a woman getting involved in war. But this became much more common for women in America, too. And of course, during the war, when men left to fight, women all of a sudden were in charge of everything, managing the household in a way that they may not have had to before, right? So they really have to step up to the plate. And a lot of women go along with the army. They become nurses, they become laundresses, and some even fight. A famous one is Molly Pitcher, who fought at the Battle of Monmouth. She took over a cannon once her husband died. And here we see a quote from a woman named Rachel Wells in a 1786 petition to Congress because of all the work she did in the American Revolution. She said, "I have done as much to carry on the war as many that sit now at the helm of government. If she did not fight, she threw in all her might which brought the soldiers food and clothing and let them have blankets." And here she's arguing that she should get some sort of pension for the government because she supported the government during the war. And in fact, some women actually disguised themselves to fight in the war. Here is Deborah Sampson, and during the war, she disguised herself as a man and fought successfully in the American Revolution. She was not the only one to disguise herself, but she was the only one to actually see battle, as far as we know, while in disguise. And then she was injured and her true identity was discovered. And she got commendations for valor, and you can see this sort of portrayal, this is much later, this portrayal of her, where they sort of emphasize her masculine features, but then there's a lot of symbols of the new government and of power that associate with it, right? She's associated not with traditional images of femininity, but images of guns, swords, the laurel wreath, you've got the dove at the bottom, but you've got a lot of flags and a lot of symbols that match her to this new American government. And she went on tour to show off her shooting powers and her fighting powers because she ended up being very poor and they wouldn't give her a pension. And so she went on tour to sort of raise money to take care of her and her husband. She was married and she had, I think, 8 kids. Now, after the Revolution, there was a sort of sense of, well, women will now go back to whatever roles they were in before, but women absolutely refused. They wanted to maintain their new rights and responsibilities. And they weren't asking for the vote. They weren't asking to put on juries. They weren't asking to have elected office, but they did want some new responsibilities. They want more respect. They want more control in domestic spheres. They want to be heard on those issues that affect them. So here's an image of Abigail Adams. She was married to John Adams, famous founding father, one of the writers of the Declaration of Independence, the second president of the United States. And they write letters back and forth throughout the war. And she writes in one letter in 1776, when John Adams is helping form the new government, she writes to him, she says, "Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." This is a wonderful letter because it sort of reflects this idea of, look, women themselves have been sort of subjugated to men's whims for a long time. So please put in laws that curbs men's power over women, right? End domestic violence, end coverture, the femme covert, right? If you don't do this, right, women are going to rebel, right? We are going to organize and we are going to hold this against you. And John Adams, as sort of enlightened as he was, he scoffs, right? He says, oh, this is too far. We know we were doing a revolution, but I didn't realize that there was going to be a revolution of women, right? That's ridiculous. But Abigail Adams was not alone in these ideas. And so we start to see this idea of Republican motherhood. And I didn't put the term on here, but it is a term I'd like you to think about. Republican motherhood is the idea that women, after the American Revolution, had a responsibility to be good mothers, especially because their children would become important voting members of this new democratic nation. Because boys were needed to be taught to be good democratic citizens, who were they going to learn that from? Well, they were going to learn it from their mothers, right? Their mothers are their first educators. Therefore, women needed to be educated to be able to teach their citizen sons. So they're the ones who need to be educated. So that's one of the major changes of the revolution, is that women need to be taught well. So they need to have a good education. They need to have rights and responsibilities. Women must teach boys to be good citizens in their roles as mothers. And so that's the new role for women. And here's a quote from Judith Sargent Murray. She said, "Would men but generously snap our chains and be content with rational fellowship instead of lavish obedience, they would find us more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better citizens." And this Republican motherhood goes a little bit towards this idea that women can be good citizens and they can support the new nation.